När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
In today's episode, I'm talking to Michael Lind. He is a writer and academic and the author of many books, such as The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Metropolitan Elite from 2020, which I highly recommend. His latest book just came out and it's called Hell to Pay, How the Suppression of Wages is Destroying America. Today we're mainly discussing the themes of these two books, how a democratic pluralism has been replaced by technocratic neoliberalism, about the overclass, which comprises about 15% of the population but amass almost all power today. How come there are so many working poor in the United States and why welfare isn't helping the problem? We also talk about why automation can't explain the offshoring of American and European manufacturing industries, at least not to the degree it's been said to, and how immigration has been weaponized to curtail workers' bargaining power. We also talk about his Swedish heritage from Småland and how his Swedish ancestors ended up picking cotton in Texas, where he now lives in Austin. Now, today's guest. You're listening to Rak Höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Michael Lind, to Rak Höger.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on, and it's especially a pleasure because I found out when we emailed each other that you actually you're a Swede, or at least part Swede.
Well, I'm half Swedish in descent. My great-grandparents on my father's side were poor peasants who immigrated from Småland after the Civil War. And ended up picking cotton in central Texas because there was a group of Smålanders who were brought in by a businessman, Swedish businessman named Swenson, who opposed slavery. And so rather than have African-American slaves pick cotton on his farm, he brought in his fellow Swedes. And then after they did their terms as indentured servants for 7 years or so, they pooled their money and they bought small cotton farms of their own. So my grandparents and great uncles and great aunts all grew up picking cotton in central Texas, attending the Swedish church. A lot of them spoke Swedish and subscribed to the Texas Posten, a Swedish newspaper that lasted until the 1970s. And then the cotton farms all went bankrupt in the Great Depression, so they moved to the city of Austin and became blue-collar working class people, janitors and gas station attendants and so on. My father was the first in his Swedish family to go to the university. He became a lawyer, so I grew up in a middle-class environment. But I learned a few Swedish words growing up. In fact, my Swedish great aunts used to take care of my brother and me, and we developed a distinct Swedish accent. Instead of asking for yellow jelly, we would ask for jello jelly.
Okay. So your family was basically part of the whole Dust Bowl era where a lot of small farmers had to move. Many moved to California, famously in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, but some apparently moved to Austin, Texas as well.
Yes, that's right, although they were right on the outside of Austin, Texas, so it wasn't a large move. One of my previous books I co-authored with an economist named Robert D. Atkinson, who formerly worked in the Clinton administration, is entitled Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. And even though I come from small farmers and small ranchers and small grocers, just the evidence shows that small businesses are much more likely to fail than large ones, and the workers are paid less and in general treated more poorly. So there's a great deal of romanticism about small firms and small businesses. Certainly in the case of my family, it's not justified.
Yeah, I feel like this is a subject of another podcast, maybe, because I'm guilty as charged. I highly romanticize small farms and the like, but it depends on what you want to accomplish in your life. But I think we'll jump into the main subject of this talk, and I would like to begin with your not the most recent, but the next recent, the second most recent book of yours, which is The New Class War: Saving Democracy from the Metropolitan Elite. Because I think it sets the stage for the most recent book very, very well, and you talk about in that book how democratic pluralism has been replaced by technocratic neoliberalism. Could we just unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Well, in the 1940s, James Burnham, who went from being Trotsky's chief lieutenant in the United States to being a pro-Reagan conservative by the 1960s, Burnham wrote a worldwide bestseller called The Managerial Revolution, building on the work of business scholars, including Adolph Burley, who was a member of Franklin Roosevelt's Brains Trust. And his argument was that Marx had been wrong about the direction of history. The bourgeois era, the era of small proprietors, was indeed disappearing, but it was not going to be replaced by socialism. It was going to be replaced by managerialism, which in Burnham's view was not simply managerial capitalism, but it was large bureaucratic organizations of all kinds, including military and nonprofits and civil servants. And in different ways, other scholars and intellectuals, Bruno Rizzi, Milovan Djilas, the economist John Kenneth Galbraith in the 1960s, made a similar argument. So I'm not being original so much, but in The New Class War, I tried to create a synthesis arguing that the actual ruling class in the United States and in most developed societies is not the capitalists. It's not, people who make all of their money as income from investments in the stock market.
It's not the Occupy Wall Street 1%. Then it's
yeah, it's much bigger than the 1%. It's about the top 10 or 15%. Those with college degrees, and particularly with graduate and professional degrees in the United States. It differs by country. But the key to power in modern managerial societies is not how much money you personally have. You can be influential, like Elon Musk, if you have a lot of money, but most of the powerful people derive their power from their function in a large bureaucracy, be it the civil service or a large corporation where you're a CEO, or a large bank, or a large university. So my argument in The New Class War is that the West has its own version of the nomenclatura. That was the name of the members of the Communist Party, which in Russia and China were never more than about a fraction of the population. Now, that doesn't mean, and I got a lot of pushback, particularly from Marxists on this. They'd say, well, but how can you say professors and civil servants and middle managers at corporations are the ruling class? They compared to Bill Gates or somebody like that. Well, the answer is that group to which I belong, I'm a member of what I call the managerial professional overclass in my book, The New Class War. Yeah. The top 10% in the United States owns 50% of the stocks and bonds and of all wealth. The 1% above us and the 90% below us own the rest, own the other half. So, and the other problem with this 1% theory is this classical Marxism, most rich capitalists, and particularly in the United States, where our intellectual property laws allow you to get rich from corporate inventions to a degree that does not exist in Japan, for example. So you don't have Japanese Bill Gateses and Japanese Elon Musk's. The corporation gets the royalties from the patents. But most of these people, if you look at Gates, at Zuckerberg, at Musk was born rich. He's an exception. He's South African. But most of them were not born into the capitalist class. They were they had very prosperous, educated parents who were ordinary professionals. So I argue that apart from a few heirs and heiresses, we really don't have a capitalist class that is distinct from the professional class below it. What we have is a dominant professional and managerial class, some of whose members, like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, luck out and they get rich, but they weren't born rich.
So is this the reason why you use the word overclass instead of upper class? Because upper class has the connotation of, 19th century bourgeoisie with top hats and like a certain lifestyle.
Exactly. So overclass is a term, it had been floating around, but I popularized it in my first book back in 1995, The Next American Nation, mainly because I got tired of saying managerial professional elite all the time. but that's what I mean. It's people with advanced educations, who have powerful positions in large public, private, and nonprofit bureaucracies, but who were not born to rich parents and don't hunt foxes like the English aristocracy. And the young women do not have debutante balls and so on.
But I was born in 1982 and became an adult during the heyday of Blair and the equivalent in Sweden, Göran Persson and Bill Clinton. And what was told then and was like the consensus, I would say, in the broader society was that you just get an education and then you get ahead. So what we need is just, if people are getting stuck or industries disappearing overseas or automation is taking over certain industries, just get an education. And what we need is upward mobility, and that will sort of solve it. And that was basically like, what we need is meritocracy, and the brilliant will rise, and regardless of their class background, race, gender. But was that consensus wrong? Or I know the answer because I've read your books, but I'll let you answer the question.
Well, the United States and Sweden and all Western democracies have become much more meritocratic. That's a good thing. We don't have formal racial discrimination or sex discrimination anymore. But the entire story is fundamentally misleading in several respects. So let's look at the narrative that it replaced. So from the 1930s up until the 1980s and 90s, we had the New Deal consensus in the United States. It was similar to the social democratic consensus in Sweden from the 30s to the 70s. The basic idea was not that if you were a working class, your children had to be professionals. That was not the idea in Europe or in the U.S. The idea was there was nothing wrong with being working class. You didn't have to go to college. As a result of technology-driven economic growth, goods would get cheaper and work hours would get shorter and wages would rise. So, the working class grandfather and grandparents would have one car, and then their children would have two cars and a slightly bigger house, and then their grandchildren would have flying cars and a robot. So that was kind of the mid-century social democratic vision. The neoliberal vision that succeeded it was that success is measured not in terms of an ever-rising standard of living and ever-shrinking work hours and ever-rising wages, but in terms of actually moving from the working class out of the working class. So implicitly being a working class person is now redefined as failures. To succeed, you must be a doctor or a lawyer or a business executive. The problem with that is there aren't that many jobs for doctors and lawyers and business executives compared to janitors and gas station attendants and restaurant cooks. In the United States, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a federal agency, none of the jobs that have the top of the top 10 jobs with the most job creation in the next 10 years requires any education beyond high school, what we call high school, except for two, registered nurse and store manager, but all of the rest, which are mostly healthcare jobs, retail jobs, restaurant workers, things like that. And these are perfectly respectable jobs. They're just paid very poorly in the United States and in some other countries. And the reason they are paid poorly, and that is the theme of my recent book, Hell to Pay, is not because these folks don't have educations. They have all the education they need to be a janitor or a home health aide. They're paid poorly because they don't have bargaining power with employers, and the main source of bargaining power is collective bargaining. It's a unionization.
So I feel I did a poor job of, as an interviewer, to have you introduce your new book by yourself. But it's Hell to Pay, and it's shorter than the New Class War, but it's a fiery book about how basically American workers below the overclass are getting paid less today than they used to, and more people today are working poor, as you describe it, than before. And could you just, because I was fiddling around with me being born in 1982, and I was just thinking what happened in 1982, and then that was the year that Bruce Springsteen wrote Born in the USA, and then 2 years later came his album Born in the USA, and it basically describes struggling blue-collar America, heartland America. And if you think about the themes in his very, everybody here in Sweden and in the United States, of course, knows his songs, and you count that was 1984, 1980s, and you count 40 years to our day, and you describe it in Hell to Pay very starkly, that it hasn't really, the people in his songs, they are not, they haven't gotten much better off. They have gotten worse off even than in those songs. But what has happened since the New Deal? The New Deal consensus was, and then came the new technocratic neoliberalism, the neoliberal consensus. So what happened to why are people getting paid less now in the United States than they used to be?
Well, the only time we've had mass middle classes in the United States or in Western Europe was when you had a combination of widespread unionization, collective bargaining, which could force employers to pay more than they would pay individuals who have no bargaining power with the employers, and tight labor markets as a result of limited immigration. For most of the 20th century, it was the labor unions that opposed mass immigration because they knew correctly that employers wanted to have as many workers competing for limited jobs as possible to prevent wage growth and to deter unionization. So open borders and mass immigration, it's basically a libertarian right-wing idea. It's not really historically a pro-labor idea. And the final element of the mid-century formula was you have to have a substantial traded sector in your economy. That's what economists call it. That is, you have to have a part of your economy that makes goods that are sold for good profits, high value added goods, manufactured goods, on world markets. You don't have, most people will not be employed in that manufacturing sector, and they weren't even in 1950 or 1960. But because there are global markets for manufacturing, you have all this money pouring into your country, even if it's a relatively small country like Sweden, and you don't have that money from renting out Airbnbs, right? Because if you just have purely local markets, then your prospects for economic growth are limited. So having a manufacturing sector, any manufacturing sector, regardless of what you manufacture in your country, brings in money from the rest of the world. So what we have done is we basically dismantled those three elements. Corporations have been allowed to transfer much production to low-wage companies to, take care of the bit lower their business costs by lowering the wages they pay foreign workers. You've had, in some cases, mercantilist regimes like China, which don't play by liberal capitalist rules, have wiped out industries in the U.S. and Europe by subsidized competition. Mass immigration, as opposed to selective immigration, having limited immigration of talented people, of humanitarian refugees, that's all very good. But you really cannot have an advanced high-wage welfare state with enormous numbers of poor, illiterate people, including most of my ancestors when they moved to the United States. They did not move.
Don't talk like that about Swedes.
Well, no, mine were very poor, uneducated Swedes, but they didn't move to the U.S. when it was a high-wage, high-tax welfare state, and you get a backlash, as we see now everywhere from the populist right against this. And finally, we assume that unions are a thing of the past, but in the absence of some kind of collective bargaining, workers really have no power to demand higher wages in most sectors which are dominated by one or a few big companies, and they're always going to be dominated by a few big companies in sectors with increasing returns to scale, like manufacturing. You can't have lots of little tiny mother and mom and pop aircraft companies and automobile companies. These are huge corporations. In the United States, a majority of Americans works for a company with more than 500 employees. So when you say that, like, this 500 worker company is engaged in bargaining over wages with a single worker, that's just a joke. There's no bargain there. It's just take it or leave it. The worker has no bargaining power. So as unpopular as it seems, you really have to combine things which nowadays are thought of as left-wing and right-wing, in my view, to have a mass middle class, like we did in the middle of the 20th century. You have to have limits on immigration. You can have generous immigration policy, but you can't let employers use it to suppress wages. You have to have limits on trade of some kind. Now, you want access to global markets, but not at the expense of losing all of your own domestic industries. And finally, as I said, you have to have collective bargaining in some form. It doesn't have to resemble the trade unions of the 19th or 20th centuries. But those are the three elements: collective bargaining, strategic trade, and limits on low-wage immigration.
So, of course, the situation in Sweden is very different. We still have powerful unions, even though they are less powerful today than they used to be. But still, the salaries are bargained between the employers and the employees, like the unions and the employer organizations. So, it seems like this is a very left-wing idea, and when I say that, the left always has been in favor of collective action on part of the workers. But in this case, it's also what you describe in Hell to Pay is that basically the employers or the big corporations, they are organized. They are using collective strategies against workers and colluding with each other, and that's been happening all along. And you quote very old texts from Adam Smith about this as well. So it's not a new phenomenon. But it seems like when I hear you talk, and I would guess that some people that hear this, that you need collective bargaining power on the part of the workers, they hear something that sounds very left-wing. But when you read your descriptions of all the strategies that corporations are using to hold down the wages of workers, and also make it harder for workers to bargain, for example, by switching jobs to a competitor, then that reaction, that knee-jerk reaction, is not present in the same way. And if you were supposed to be angry at workers unionizing or having collective bargaining power, why don't you have like an outcry about corporations colluding with each other in the same way?
Well, that's a good point. As you point out, there are three beneficiaries from the profits of a private corporation. There are the shareholders, and they act collectively. The shareholders appoint the board of directors in the U.S. They have a committee that, they work as a group to increase their profits. There are the managers, the CEO and the CEO's deputies, who obviously work as a coordinated group, even if there are hundreds of them. But then you say, workers, this is terrible that like the workers can pool their efforts like the managers and the shareholders. Well, a lot of this is simply explained by the fact that I go into in my book, The New Class War, that the institutions that used to represent the interests and values of the working class in the U.S. and many similar countries, not just the trade unions, but also churches, which were very important in politics in many Western countries half a century ago, and on the left as well as on the right, and political parties that genuinely were accountable to working class people. In the United States, the Democratic and Republican parties up until the 1970s were federations of state and local parties. And what has happened is all three of these institutions that gave workers some influence on government between elections. And that's when the policymaking is done. It's done between elections. So it's not just a matter of gathering together votes, but organized groups influence policy between the elections. Those groups have disintegrated. And private sector organized labor in the U.S. has collapsed from a third of the private sector workforce to 6% and falling, which is lower than it was in the 1920s, 100 years ago. Religion is declining in the U.S. Almost as rapidly as in Europe. Now, this may be a long-term social trend. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it does remove another institution that deals with working class people every Sunday or on a Saturday in the case of Jewish people. And finally, local parties. There's a difference between countries. For example, so the parties in Europe are stronger than they are in the United States. At this point, the state and local parties have ceased to exist. The Democratic and Republican parties are just labels that are bought by groups of politicians and their billionaire backers and business lobbies. So, for example, Donald Trump was a Democrat most of his life, apparently. He gave money to Democrats. He then tried and failed to take over Ross Perot's Reform Party in the year 2000. And then he took over the Republican Party and became its nominee and president. So in the absence of these intermediate groups that can represent their views and their economic interests, it's not a conspiracy. I'm not saying the overclass is some kind of conspiratorial cabal. It's just that there's no external balance.
So this is where the democratic pluralism comes in. That you describe in the New Class War, this is present in the big parties in Europe as well. used to be, if you look at the Labour Party in Great Britain, for example, you used to have people who were actually from the trades, working class trades, and then they became politicians. But now I think there's one left in the whole party in parliament, and you do basically a career within the party in the same way you do a career within NGOs or the business sector, and you work your way up, and most of the representatives are highly educated, so socially they're not different than the people in the Tory party. For the most part, it's the same kinds of people. If you squint your eyes and look, it's hard to notice the difference. But if you go back even to the 90s or 80s, then they were more representative than they are now. But this why is this? I mean, there's a tension here also, like in the word technocratic and like expertise, and because the overclass is, of course, more educated. It's more professional. It's has more merits, and I mean, if you take complicated issues, you would say that we don't need people to be represented. We need the best solution, and we need the best practice here, and we are the best experts in this field. So even though there are people here who in this country who disagree, it will also benefit them against their will, and we don't need them represented. We need them to accept and not be fact-denying reactionaries or some such. So is that also tension, or am I describing it wrong?
No, well, I think that's right. Obviously, my argument is that we will have a managerial elite for centuries or millennia to come. This is not going to go away. This is the new pattern of society. The question is how to make this elite, and it will be largely hereditary because educated people tend to pass on their benefit, their privilege to their college-educated children. But by what mechanism do we make them accountable to the working class majority? Now, a lot of them, they don't want to be accountable. They say, well, we're educated, and therefore we know what is best for the working class, not only in terms of narrow technical policies, but in terms of what they should or should not want. And this is, illegitimate to me. So, for example, if you're in terrible pain in your leg and you go to your doctor, you don't have to be an expert on medicine, to know that your leg is in terrible pain. You just describe the symptoms, and the doctor either cures the pain or you doesn't. And if the doctor doesn't, you get another doctor. But our elites are kind of like a doctor who you go to the doctor and say, I have terrible pain in my leg. And the doctor says, well, no, you don't. You're imagining it. This is not real pain. You really have pain in your arm, and we're going to address that. And so to bring this down to earth, you have majorities in the United States, certainly. And as long as this has been counted from the 1970s to the present, they have wanted less immigration. Our elite gives them more immigration every decade. Our majorities in the United States have been opposed to cutting Social Security, our retirement program. Both Republicans and Barack Obama, some of his Democrats, have tried to cut it. Most Americans want fewer foreign wars. Every president, with the exception of Trump, has launched a new war, for better or worse. Now, so you can conclude, well, Americans really should be poorer. They should get less Social Security. They should compete more with low-wage immigrants. And we should send more of them to die in foreign wars that the sons and daughters of the elite do not fight. But that's not democracy. I mean, that's just oligarchy at that point. And it's oligarchy disguised as technocracy because if you look at the policies that are favored by the American overclass, I won't talk about the European overclass, although it's similar, isn't it a coincidence that they just happen to fit the economic interests of the overclass. So, for example, the Biden administration wants to forgive all of these student loans for college graduates who are the most privileged members of the society. There's no pressure to forgive car loans or automobile loans for working class people. It's this unique loan situation for college students. And I'm not necessarily against forgiving the loans for college students, but why don't we forgive loans that working class people have as well?
Because, cars, they contribute to the climate crisis, and education is the solution.
Well, that's the claim. In fact, the climate crisis of the United States provides only 15% of the world's greenhouse gases. Countries like Sweden and Britain and France and Denmark are not even on the map. There's no point for medium and small countries that contribute to 0.001% of greenhouse gases to, think they're going to save the planet. Basically, it's China and India. If you get them from burning coal to cleaner methods, that's it. But you do get this lifestyle thing. So the only people who can afford in the United States to live in expensive cities, and I spent most of my career in D.C. and New York because I could afford to, and use mass transit, are the rich and the well-paid professionals. Then they say, these terrible proles, these proletarians out there in the suburbs driving their cars to work, how terrible. They should all come in and live with us, in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., or live in downtown Manhattan. Why can't they be like us civilized people? And it's the same kind of class blindness that leads our college-educated class to say, we all have great
Trippelt välkommen tillbaka säger vi till cheeseburgarnas cheeseburgare. Ja, vi pratar såklart om triple cheese på McDonald's. Lika god som vår cheeseburgare, fast trippelt. Bara på McDonald's.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
College degrees from selective universities and Ivy League universities. Why can't 100% of Americans go to good schools like the University of Texas or Yale or Harvard, where I've either been a student or taught? And again, the reason is that there are only a small number of jobs that require advanced degrees. And the college-educated managers and professionals will always be a minority of the population. So you're basically telling the majority of your country that they are failures if they do not belong to the top 10% in education and professional status.
I actually had one of my oldest friends. We grew up on the same street. We have the same background, and but while the rest of us went to university, he didn't, because he failed school for different reasons. And so one time he was like really distraught, and he said, like, why are you even associating with me? I'm such a loser. You should not be friends with me. And I mean, that kind of shame that, he was doing, he was in the military, he was a nurse, he's a nurse. So he was doing good jobs. Jobs that are needed. It's just not being such a very important person like myself, recording podcasts and writing texts. Everybody can't do those kinds of essential jobs.
Exactly.
You need the journalists, but not the nurses. But that kind of, I have a hard time thinking that if you go back 50 years, a nurse or somebody in the armed forces would say, like, my job, I'm such a loser with this job compared to that guy sitting at a desk.
The culture was different. If you look at the U.S. media, it used to celebrate working class people, right? And the New Deal era, you had murals of of dam workers and factory workers and all kinds of workers, female workers. On television, you had a show called The Honeymooners with Jackie Gleason, a bus driver and his wife. And those are the shows people watched. And then you go to the 1990s and you get this TV show Friends, where it's a bunch of rich kids apparently living in a massive, expensive Midtown Manhattan apartment. They apparently don't do any work. That's true. Same was true of Seinfeld, right? It's unclear where their money is coming from.
Very unclear.
And so there was this one show, Roseanne, with Roseanne Barr. That was the only show with a working class family on TV, and they were portrayed as kind of freaks and grotesque.
We have a Married with Kids with Al Bundy.
Yeah, so essentially you had these. I mean, I know a lot of screenwriters and TV writers in LA. They're all from Harvard or Yale, and they're writing these TV shows making fun of working class people, and making caricatures of them. So that's where you get Donald Trump, and it's where you get Boris Johnson and Berlusconi and so on, because not only do you not serve the economic material interests of the working class, but the way they see themselves in media, they are being mocked and shamed and caricatured.
Yeah, but and I mean, if you go back to the same era that you described, when you had more positive working class portrayals, and that it wasn't something you were. I think I read in one of David Goodhart's books. I think it's the British Dream, that like if you asked somebody from a working class blue collar job in the 50s in Britain, 70% said that they were like essential for the industry and the economy of the country, and now it's basically like 15%. So it's a huge difference in how you view yourself, and of course that ties into how the society views you. But at the same time, then you had you get the riposte now when if somebody heard us talking now that you're looking back to through a rosy lens towards the 50s, but what about the minorities, Black people in the United States especially, and women, homosexuals, sexual minorities? It wasn't so rosy for them, and then you get this argument sort of like, if you think that something was better, then you're sort of in favor of racism, misogyny.
It's ridiculous, because what they're saying is you have to choose, okay? You can have a high-wage society, as in the 1950s, but you have to discriminate against Black people and women and homosexuals. Or you can be pro-gay and feminist and anti-racist, but we're going to have huge inequality and we're going to drive wages down. That's ridiculous. You don't have to choose. You can have modern social equality and 1950s type wages and benefits at the same time. The political barrier to that is not that these things are incompatible. They're perfectly compatible. It's that we have elites which consciously use racial and gender divisions, both on the left and the right, to distract attention from the economic issues that people share. I follow the polls. There is a class divide within African Americans. There is a class divide within Hispanic Americans. And if you look at the top issues for white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans who are working class, according to the pollsters, this is the data, it's the same issues. It's the same issues. They want better jobs, safety from criminals, good schools for their children, health care, and retirement security. But then you ask our elites, well, what is the Black agenda? And they say quotas on corporate boards and racial quotas in elite university admissions. That's not actually what most Black working class Democrats want, or most Hispanic Democrats. But so the entire race and gender politics, and then of course, when you have this aggressive multiculturalism and quotas by the elite left, then that creates enormous resentment on the part of the non-Hispanic white working class because they're being discriminated against on the basis of their race. So there's a huge backlash, and that helps these cynical politicians on the right.
But how? I mean, what you had in if you go back to the 80s and then or maybe the 70s, and then it took a downward trajectory. But you had what's called in English living wages for if you were a blue collar worker, you could support a family on being a janitor, for example, and or an industry worker. And now what you describe is sort of from a Swedish perspective, at least, or maybe I'm not talking for all Swedes here, but from my perspective, is sort of dystopian that many Americans today, much more and regardless of race, are working poor. Like they have the same kinds of jobs that used to be you were able to support a family on those wages, but on that wage. But now you have two parents sometimes working, and they still have to be on welfare. And it's not no questions asked welfare like child allowances in Sweden, for example, goes to everybody. But it's needs tested. So you have to prove that you're deserving of the welfare that you need to support yourselves, and while you're working full time.
Yes, the United States in this respect is different from the Nordic countries and also from Western Europe, although Britain is close to the US. But we now have this category of a fifth to a quarter of the population that is called the working poor. Even if they work 40 hours a week full time, their wages are so low they cannot survive without means-tested welfare programs like food stamps and housing vouchers and the earned income tax credit. And to make it even more of a nightmare for these poor people, these are all separate programs. They have to apply separately to different agencies. For the one agency for the food stamps, the Internal Revenue Service for the earned income tax credit. They have to do enormous amounts of paperwork, which is a struggle for less educated people.
It's a struggle for educated people as well. So you need free time to be able to fill in all the paperwork. Continue.
But so a friend of mine in the 90s, a social scientist, he went to Europe and he asked European social scientists, well, what's the situation of the working poor in Europe? And the European laughed and he said, if you work in Europe, you're not poor. And that's changed somewhat, but the United States is uniquely bad in this respect. For example, I don't know the statistics in Sweden, but if you look in Denmark, the people who work at McDonald's are unionized and they make a living wage. In the United States, they're among the poorest of the poor, fast food workers. So now a lot of American progressives do not understand the Swedish model or the Scandinavian model. They think it's all about taxing the rich and giving money to the poor. And as you know, the Scandinavian model, classic social democratic model, even though it's been reformed, is based on wage compression with the help of trade unions. So you don't get the enormous amount of wage inequality before taxes that you do in the United States. And the problem is when you get, like the United States at this point is more like a Central American country, like Honduras or Guatemala in its inequality. When you get that level of inequality in wages, it is simply impossible politically to tax the rich in order to redistribute income to the poor. So that's why I really emphasize the role of collective bargaining to decrease the wage gap between the rich and the poor. And also, as you know, to have a generous welfare social insurance system, to have a universal social insurance system, as in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, that's paid for at least partly by payroll taxes, you have to have fairly well-paid workers. Because for the payroll tax revenue to support the universal programs. And if the workers are too poor, then their payroll taxes don't amount to much money. And you have to have giant crippling taxes on the rich, which being powerful, they can easily evade. In the case of Sweden, they will leave the country, like Ingmar Bergman, right? He was a tax expatriate.
Yeah,
So
and
Peter Lindert, who is a Swedish-American scholar, who was former head of the American Economics Association, he wrote a paper pointing out that Sweden decided in the 1970s to support its generous social insurance system, not by overtaxing the rich, but by having broad-based taxes like the VAT, the value-added tax, and payroll taxes, right?
Yeah. The challenge in Sweden is now that we have a highly unionized job market, but we have because of like many of the work jobs that are being offered are you need skills, and you can debate how much skills you really need for some of these jobs. Like the employers can pick and choose sometimes, and they tend to favor highly educated workers, even though might not be the best fit. But that's the case. And then we have had a very large migration to Sweden, and with the least skilled, least educated people of the groups of immigrants of all Western countries. So if you look at like ethnic Swedes and skilled immigrants, then we have basically no unemployment, and schools are working fine. But because of the share of the population of people with very few skills, and some can't read or write, and that problem is much bigger in Sweden than in comparable countries, and we have a much bigger share of our population that's immigrants. Then now we have like the conflict between indigenous workers that are and also earlier waves of migration that's been more integrated, conflict between them, their interests and their bargaining power, and like the interests of people who can work for much less and who can could compete maybe. That's the challenge in Sweden. We have a big shadow economy as well, like restaurants and the building industry, like building of houses, and like there it's not as well functioning anymore. And so, but that's a bit different from the challenges in the United States, I would say.
No, but you see, one challenge that is shared is if you bring in lots of unskilled immigrant workers, expanding the labor force, it reduces the incentive of employers to invest in labor-saving technology, to turn to innovative technology, so that you can pay workers more while still producing as much or more than you produced before. And you can actually get backward technological evolution. We have seen this in both Britain and the United States with car washes. So most car washes in the United States are automated. But in places with high levels of poor immigrants, such as New York City, there's been a reversion to hand car washes because there were so many Latin American immigrants. They were called car washeros, a sort of Spanish word, that you would have 5 poor men and women from Mexico or Central America scrubbing your car instead of one automated machine. And this is happening now in Britain.
Yeah, you have a great statistic in Hell to Pay, where it's from between 2006 and 2016, the number of automated car washes fell by half, while the number of hand car washes exploded. Which is counterintuitive then, because we are told we are always becoming more advanced, automated. Robots are becoming better, and but if it's cheap enough, apparently you can replace robots with workers.
Yeah, so I live in a suburb of Austin, Texas, where I grew up. They're just gangs of Mexican and Central American lawn guys and gardeners cutting the grass because of the available pool of immigrant labor. Now, when I was a kid, it was very low immigration period, so people cut their own grass with increasingly sophisticated lawnmowers. And certainly, I would have thought as a child that in Austin in the 2020s, we would have robot lawnmowers. but there's no demand for robot labor. There's no consumer demand. People are cheaper.
We have here in Europe, at least when I grew up, and in many parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, you have the indigenous population or the majority population. They are in every class of people, so they are the overclass, middle class, and the working class. If you go to Finland, for example, you will find Finns working as cleaners in hotels and in cafeterias, and of course there's immigrants, but much fewer. But if you have a cleaner in your corporation or then everybody has a darker complexion than the journalists working there. So I worked at a big paper. I used to work at Svenska Dagbladet. So like everybody of us who was sitting at a desk writing very important words, most of us at least, were white ethnic Swedes, and everybody who was cleaning were from either a Middle Eastern, Latin American, Eastern European, or an African country. And that's basically like all the jobs that don't require high skills have become sort of an ethnic marker in Sweden. So
I was born into Texas in 1962. It was still segregated for 2 more years. It was a caste system with black labor under whites, including white labor. The last few times I've been to Europe, to Rome, to London, and Paris, all of the cleaners and the maids in my hotels have been black African immigrants. Yeah. And all of their bosses have not.
Exactly.
And so I've told my friends, it's like Europe is turning into the old South, right?
Yes, that's a very provocative statement, but I find it to be true, and it's I don't like it. I have a very hard time hiring. Well, I feel like Southern an American like plantation lord or something when you hire and everybody who's supposed to do the manual labor for you are recently arrived from Africa. It feels wrong to me. And I understand the argument that it's better for them. It's better for people to have a job than not have a job. That's what my friends who don't have the same problem tell me, and that I have a strange middle class shame of buying services. But it's something more. It's what you said. The word caste system that used to be. It's because I know that these people don't have the same opportunities, and the children most likely won't have either, and so it doesn't feel right.
Well, I have never. Maybe it's my background from these poor ancestors. I have never had a maid or any household help. Because I guess that's what I got from my Swedish peasant working class ancestors. You clean your own bathroom. You do your own clothes.
Yeah, right? It sounds very Swedish. Yeah. You clean your own dirt.
Unfortunately, obviously, it was totally different attitude in the American South where they found themselves. And now this attitude is spread to the U.S. and, as you say, maybe to the entire Western world. So now my class, the university educated class, I'm very rare in doing my own household chores. They have usually immigrant, usually very poorly paid maids. They have nannies for their children. They have gardeners for their lawns. And America was not like this in the 1970s and 80s. And Europe wasn't either, I suspect. The other analogy I use beside the Old South is the British Raj in India, where you could be a middle class or working class Brit, and then you moved to India and you just had servants waiting on you day and night. It's like a colonial society.
I mean, the argument is that if you would have living wages in these occupations, and if you would raise the wages so that people and the working conditions, because I want to talk about everything you write about in the latest book, but I'm going to have to let you go soon. But like you have the gig jobs like Uber and Foodora here in Sweden, like people going by bikes and delivering food, and it's not always that they are being just paid bad salaries. It's also that the working conditions are pretty awful, and when they are unionized, you can have a subcontractor come in, and you can fire your we don't have the money to pay you anymore, so we have to fire you, and then you hire the subcontractor instead, and you don't have to pay the union salary. So that's a way to circumvent it. But would these sectors disappear, and is there an argument to be made that I'm not sure who it was that you quoted, you are paid what you deserve. So if you are a maid and you get paid an awful wage, that's because that's how productive you really are in the economy, and you can't change that. That's just like a natural fact, and that's the same for if you work at McDonald's, for example, and you get paid like $8.
That's the official theory of the neoliberal elite, that wages are fixed by the market and they can't be altered by policies, whether it's unionization or immigration restriction. That is, you have this single wage that for a janitor, it's fixed by the market. And if you try to raise it above that wage by unionization, you'll have mass unemployment and so on. But our establishment in the US and Europe has two contradictory stories. Because on the one hand, they say that wages are set by the market. On the other hand, they say that immigration doesn't affect wages because they're set by the market. And somehow immigration does not affect the labor market. But then whenever there's a drop in immigration, certainly it's true in the US, I think it's probably true in Europe too, they say, oh, we need more immigrants, otherwise we will have price inflation. Now think about that. How can a lack of immigrants cause price inflation? They never tell you the mechanism, do they? If you don't have enough immigrants, then the employers have to raise wages to get the natives and the immigrants who are already here to work at the same jobs for higher wages. And at that point, the employers may, if they can't find cheaper ways to do it, they may pass on the higher wage costs to consumers in the form of higher prices. But they don't tell you that. They skip that part in the middle about tight labor markets leading employers to pay higher wages. But they say this again and again. You must have seen this. We will have massive price inflation without increases in immigration. And the mechanism is they implicitly admit it, though they don't state it outright, that immigrants are suppressing wage growth by competing with natives and previous immigrants.
In Britain, there's been an argument for a long time, and here in Sweden, especially when it comes to some sectors like berry picking up north, for example, you take in seasonal workers from Thailand or elsewhere, and you can see them by the roadside during the season, and they just they live in their cars and they pick berries and then they go home. And the argument has been we can't find domestic workers to do the same job. And I know in Hell to Pay, in your latest book, you bring up the American agricultural sector as a sector where that argument has been made as well. But has that argument no merit at all, or is it just a ploy?
Well, it assumes that technology will be static forever, all right? And it assumes that labor market conditions do not influence technological innovation. So, for example, in the United States, my grandparents, as I said, grew up picking cotton. It's a horrible, horrible job. Nobody wants to do it. That's why there was slavery. In the 1940s, agricultural scientists at the University of at Texas A&M University and other places, after decades and decades of research, devised machines that could harvest cotton. So we don't have poor people harvesting cotton in the United States anymore. We have machines to do it. In Japan, they don't have enormous numbers of immigrants. They have berries in Japan, Japanese berries and Japanese tomatoes and things like that, even they don't have poor people from other countries picking them. How do they do it? They have high-tech, largely automated greenhouses with hydroponic technology. So if the job is so miserable that your native citizens and your assimilated immigrants don't want to do it, there are three options. Just don't do it. That's one of them. Just don't do it at all. The second option, as opposed to importing immigrants, is to raise wages until local people want to do it. And the third option is to invest in research and development to come up with a machine that can do it.
And lastly, we've talked about immigration, but we haven't gone into so much the offshoring and how the narrative, as you point out in your book, like the narrative has been that automation and robotics has replaced the workers in America, for example, and also here in Sweden. But it's so we have had our industries has become more advanced instead, but employs less people, and so that. But what you show and what you what's been like this come out a lot of studies in the last few years that shows that it's that the reason the jobs have mostly disappeared to China and countries of the like, and so the corporation is intact, but you basically you fire your workers in the industry, in the manufacturing industry, and then you have them pay to buy back the stuff that they used to do themselves by cheap labor from China or countries like that.
That's absolutely right. I wish the automation story about the decline of U.S. manufacturing employment were right. There's been some automation, obviously, but if it were true, then Detroit would be like the richest city in the United States. It would have all these gleaming robot factories. And they would be cranking out all these high-tech, maybe robot cars. What really happened was the car companies did not fire the human workers in Detroit to replace them with gleaming new high-tech robot factories in Detroit. They replaced the human workers in Detroit with low-wage automobile workers in Mexico and in other industries with low-wage workers in China. I mean, that's the story. It was labor arbitrage. It was not automation.
I worked at one of the last big shipyards in Scandinavia, in Denmark, and it just closed down recently. We built the biggest container ships. I had a very little to do with it, but I was cleaning and doing dirty work on those ships for a while. And but isn't this just creative destruction? I mean, that's what a term that's been used like a magic wand.
No, it's mercantilism. If you go back the last 200 years, the only shipbuilding countries, including the Scandinavians, the British, the Germans, Polish, and later the East Asians, they deliberately subsidized their shipbuilding industries. The moment they cut off the subsidies, the shipbuilding industry collapses, and other countries gain market share. So the United States cut off its shipbuilding industry subsidies in the 1980s. The U.S. doesn't make civilian ships anymore. It's completely collapsed. As a result, Japan in the 70s and 80s, and then South Korea, and now China have dominated the global shipbuilding industry. How did they do it? Creative destruction, the free market? No, they cheated. They poured vast amounts of subsidies into shipbuilding, which is a rational tool of mercantilist state capitalist regimes, because there's in economics, there's a phenomenon called dumping. But let's say you have a grocery store and I have a grocery store, and I want to drive you out of business. What I'll do is I will accept a loss on my goods that I sell. I will sell them below cost. I will lose money for 6 months once I steal all of your rival customers. And once all of your customers come over to mine for the low prices, then your grocery store goes out of business. And at that point, guess what? I have a monopoly and I can raise prices and recoup all of my cost. So, and this is true increasingly in a global economy of every major manufacturing industry. China has engaged in all kinds of industrial policies, including dumping, that is, selling goods below their cost on global markets, deliberately to wipe out the manufacturing of other countries in the US and Europe and Asia, and then to have near monopolies in global markets. One single Chinese company that makes civilian drones, DJI, has more than 50% of all civilian drones in the world. This is a technology that was invented in Nazi Germany and has been developed in the US. But and so the Chinese growth in market share, part of it is simply development of China. That would have happened anyway because they have a larger domestic home market. But most of it is not capitalism. It's cheating. It's mercantilism.
So I just want to end with sort of a very broad question, but does your arguments and your thoughts on this have any traction within the mainstream politics in the US? Because some of it sounds more like Bernie Sanders, and some of it sounds perhaps more like Donald Trump. But as you point out in your book, Joe Biden and some of the more libertarian-leaning or mainline Republicans, they don't think like this. But how has your argument been received by the? Is there any hope for this?
Well, there's a group of post-liberal thinkers on the Republican right, populists, including Senators Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who has come out in favor of trade unions in some cases, who are pushing back on the whole Reagan-Thatcher neoliberalism, and they realize that you can't just be hostile to the working class because most Republican voters are working class. But they're still a minority. The Republican Party is still very much dominated by Reagan free market ideologues. Unfortunately, there's also sympathy for some of these ideas in the Democratic Party, but the Bernie Sanders classical social democratic wing is declining. And the other problem with them is they're very good on pro-labor policies and universal social insurance. But the Democrats are absolutely terrified of criticizing not only mass low-wage immigration for fear that other Democrats will call them racists, but even now, even opposing trade sanctions on China is being denounced by some on the left as racist and anti-Asian, which is ridiculous. To call retaliating against an authoritarian police state racist, but so I think in the long term, you will see elements in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party can get behind something like the agenda I've set forth, and in Congress, if not in the White House, they can collaborate on some reforms across party lines.
Let's hope that is what will happen. Thank you, Michael Lind, for being part of Rak Höger.
Tack så mycket.
Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Gå gärna in och skriv en recension på Apple Podcasts eller i den app där du lyssnar på podden. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Och den som prenumererar där kan även ta del av de texter jag skriver. Gillar man det man läser och hör får man gärna bli betalande prenumerant för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 om året. Då får man ta del av lite exklusivt extra material också. Du hittar rubbet på ivararpi.se. Och har du några frågor eller synpunkter kan du alltid mejla mig på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs igen.